Hello, BookTube. I'm back with another video. As the title says, it will be this, but I'll be adding a couple things. It'll be endnotes, footnotes, or no notes. I'll be talking about notes and annotation and a few other things with regards, because I'm with the annotation, I'm going to sort of add in the introductions, which can be critical in that. But as everybody, I'm sure, is aware that, you know, some books, especially nonfiction, will have a note. Like it'll have a little number or a letter by a sentence or a quote, and it'll refer to a note that's either at the bottom of the page or at the back of the book. That gives you a little more explanatory information, or exactly the reference where the quotation is from, or the rest of the quotation, or the author's thoughts on it, or the implications of it, all that type of stuff. And for notes, generally, that's kept to sort of a minimum, I would say, like the minimum information. Now, partially to me, it's the location of where these notes are that matters to me. Not so much that I will refuse to read a book because it's not in the format in the way that I want. I prefer the notes at the bottom of the page, even if they're long. I've read books that, if anybody's read anything by Sir Richard Francis Burton or Toynbee's Study of History, you can get notes that go on and on and on, and I love those. Then at that point it's almost going on into annotation in a sense, but we'll get that to that in a moment. So I prefer them down at the bottom of the page, so it's easier. I find it frustrating when they're at the back, when they're the end notes, because you have to keep flipping back and forth. You need two bookmarks. And I also find that when they're at the back, I'm engrossed into whatever I'm reading, especially when it's fiction. Non-fiction, it's a little different, but with fiction, I'll miss, the notes that are in there at times. I'll miss it. So what I generally wind up doing is, for the fiction ones, I will read, especially if there's a chapter, I'll read the chapter unless it's extremely long. Then I will go and read the notes for that chapter. I know it's not the best way, but it's compromise of either not reading them because they're there because I want to read them, and hopefully they're there to enlighten things. So sometimes I have to go back into the text and find where that reference is and see what the connection is. The best way is to pause for a second and look at the notes. Now, but that does get a little bit of problem with fiction. It does interrupt your flow of the story to do this. But if they are done well, the notes, they will add to the pleasure. For me, they will add to the pleasure of the reading. Not to everybody. Some people would think that, that's where the no notes come in. And I'm curious, how many people like notes? And if you like notes, where are they? Where would you prefer them? And also to what extent, because I'm going to get into how detailed and how big are the notes. But yeah, and what made me think of this, because it brought up a memory on the live that we did. This is going to be scheduled for a few days hence. But we did it live. I did with Mark and myself, and we brought up the topic of cheap editions. There was the Penguin Popular Classics, but the one I'm thinking of is the Wordsworth Classics, where they're cheap in price and still very good. You get good text for low prices. They have introductions, and we'll get the introductions in a minute. But a lot of times they do have notes. And I've recently, last year sometime, I decided I really want to read through Virginia Woolf again. Well, I read her first book called The Voyage Out, and I'd not read that before. But I'd read 4 others before. And so I've now read 5 of her books, but I'm going to reread the others as well in chronological order. Well, when I say 5, one of them is, Room of One's Own, or whatever the exact title is. That's not really fiction. So let's say I've read 4 of her fiction books. The Voyage Out has a really nice introduction, and that's the one thing. It's a good introduction, but yeah, as I say, we'll get to that. The notes, though, are endnotes in this. And Virginia Woolf was a prolific reader. She's read a lot of stuff. And she, in her diary, in her essays and letters, she talks about authors that she read and in the reviews, essays. Uh, you know, so the character in there, and I guess being her first book, this it might be in the others. I'm sure it is, but I don't remember it as much because this is more fresh in memory. The character in there will, like a shotgun effect, talk, list out almost like a dozen authors. Most of them are known, like Jane Austen, Charles Dickens, I think even Mark Twain. She'll list off authors that are all read today, all known. But then there are the ones that are a little more obscure because they've sort of been lost to the sands of time. So when I start seeing, I seen all these footnotes, all the references to the footnotes, like, a dozen or more, and I go, ooh. So I flip to the back. Jane Austen, born, 1774 was it, and died 1870, whatever. Birthday, and then say, a writer of, that's it. Then you look at the next one, Charles Dickens. Do I really need to know this information? Well, I'm reading it. Well, did I need to interrupt my reading to read something that I already know? And my answer was no, I didn't. And then when Charles Dickens shows up again in the text, there's another note to refer back to the original one, and it's like, oh. And it's like, I found extremely frustrating because what I was hoping for when I flipped to it was the editor or whoever did the notes to reference Jane Austen's diaries, letters, essays, anything else that she had said about said author. Now that's where you get you start moving in, I think, to annotation, what I'd call annotation, where there's a lot more detail. But that's fine. I think there's a point where you can still put that stuff into the notes, preferably footnotes, without quite being called annotation. I could be wrong, but I think there is it's sort of a sliding scale. You got a note that just says a date, of when this happened. And then you've got an annotation, like something that is much, much more detailed and give you that much more information. Now, I'm talking about fiction here, in this case. And I think it's the same in nonfiction as well. But the thing is, you don't have sort of annotation other than somebody else coming along for an older work giving all that information that would have or could have been notes at the time. But anyway, let's just concentrate to fiction now. So it didn't have that, and I found that just because it was in the back, it was frustrating. And then going to look at it and giving me the information that I already know was frustrating. Because to me, if it mentions an author that I don't know, if it's just a name, I will pass that by and I will maybe check that up later. But it might have, a name. Like, you don't need, to me, having a note for that is a pain in the butt. Because you're breaking the flow of reading for information that doesn't really help you with that. If the character or the story warrants that they talk about that or they reference to it, then maybe you need some kind of reference to that author. Hopefully a little more than just birth and death dates. Otherwise, they could just have an appendix saying, listing the authors referred to. That's all you need. You don't need the note to go back and forth. Could have been just a listing of authors referred to with the birth and death dates, and that's it. And if you wanted to know anything more about them, today we got the internet. It's generally very easy, not always, because not everything's there, but that's a good place to start. Or even better, the National Dictionary of Biography, 60 volumes. Great places to go to read about authors or people. So that is a bit frustrating. Now, like as I say, we're getting into with this extra material. Like if it had all the extra stuff about Jane Austen and Dickens from her letters and the references and explanation of what she said. Now, as I say, if it's got it briefly, I still think they fit in for the notes. I'm curious to what other people think. Is that then, because you're getting into that extra stuff, is that annotation immediately? Or, like I would think is, they're still notes, but they're straying into annotated territory. But, if it then goes, if they expand it and give the full quotations and a full, thing, like a full description of that, then that's annotation. Now, you do get a lot of books that say they're annotated, and I'll show you one here. And to me, they're in between. It's an in-between thing in this case. And I showed this before. It's the new editions of Orwell that are put out by Constable. And they started with 1984 and then did Animal Farm, and they're going backward. And there's earlier this year in the spring they did Coming Up for Air and Keep the Apodistra Flying. And I'm expecting next year The Clergyman's Daughter and Burmese Days. But they are introduced and annotated by D.J. Taylor. Now let's look first of all at the introduction. It's a nice little introduction. It's small. I kind of think I know what he's going to say in the introduction, but I might be surprised because I've read a lot of D.J. Taylor's work regarding Orwell. But then again, I always forget, so I will always read anything that he writes or any introduction to any Orwell book, just to see if there's a different take on it or different information. Sometimes I sort of wish I could excise all these introductions to everything of Orwell and other authors or specific authors, all their introductions, and just put it in one book. That would be nice. And before anybody puts a note down below, yes, I know you could potentially do that and create an ebook from it if you had enough ebooks. I am aware of that. So you got the introduction. And I'll say about the introduction if I haven't already said this, because I've tried to make this video a couple times and I've restarted, so I'm forgetting maybe exactly what I've said in which one. Introduction. If there's anything critical about or thoughts specifically about the text, I prefer that at the end. Even if I've read the book before and I know it. Because when it's at the beginning, I have the urge to read it. And a lot of people read the introduction first and they haven't read the book. Sometimes that can be helpful to them to have a guide. I don't like having that guide. I prefer to read it myself for the first time, without being told, look for this is what the meaning is, or whatever. That's a personal preference of mine. I prefer it at the end, or read it at the end regardless of location. But to me, it would be best put as an afterword or as an appendix. The stuff that I like at the beginning would be maybe a biographical sketch, which I'm perfectly fine with. If it's a translation, the issues that the translator had, it's perfectly fine. And what text are they using? even if it's English. Like, what text are they using here, especially if there's differences in the text, and maybe even a publishing history of it. That could be kind of cool if there's anything worth saying for that, and all that kind of stuff for me is perfectly fine at the beginning. What do you think? Like, do you prefer to have, if you've never read the book before, do you prefer to have the critical information to read that first before you read it, so you know what you're getting into? Or do you prefer to make up your own mind first, then read it and go, "Ooh, I never thought of that. Oh, yeah, I didn't see that." And that's the thing. And like I say, when I've read, like, I've read 1984 now like 3 or 4 times, somewhere around that, and I'll be reading it again. I probably have no problem with reading the introduction before I read it again, but I won't. When I reread this, I won't read the introduction until I've reread it. Then I'll go with the introduction. But I'll occasionally will when I got this. I think I probably did when I got this. I read the introduction, so I'm contradicting myself here. But I didn't reread the book, so I've forgotten sort of exactly what he says in it. But it's called Annotated. It says right on the cover and right on the title page. It says Annotated by DJ Kaler. Now, most people are, well, not most people, but the annotations that are coming out now are nice big hardcover books where the text is in a narrow column, not a narrow column, but there's wide margins, and the notes, the annotations are at the place beside, more or less, where it's referring to. And I always like it when it's a different color. It's just aesthetic things. That's just an aside. But in this one, obviously, it's a paperback. You can't really do that. It'd be really difficult to do. So they're in the back. There's about 50 pages of extra material and appendices. He's got the notes. So these are sort of paragraph notes. Some are longer. Some are like a page long or a little more than a page. So to me, they're still... Well, I've yet to read. I've yet to read his notes / annotations, so I can't really say specifically for this. But I think anything that's annotated could put 10 times the information of that in there. Sometimes it might be information that the reader already knows, but I think a lot of stuff can be useful information, because when somebody writes something, they are writing a lot of times, obviously, these are obvious things I'm saying, at least I hope they are. They are writing about a certain time period, and they'll reference things that every reader will know. They don't need to explain that in the text or put a footnote to explain that, because everybody knows, and it'll just deter from the reading. Institutions that are no longer around. Cultural things that are no longer around. Slang that is no longer used, that is archaic, now almost. So that's useful to have that information. But sometimes as a reader, if you read a lot of this stuff, you've already checked this stuff out. You don't need to look at that. But it's good to have that in there, for this. And that's where, but still, in the footnotes. Now, are those things annotations? Yes, they can be. And they are, because notes are annotations. But to me, an annotated book has much more to it. For instance, when I referred to Virginia Woolf's The Voyage Out, like I would expect in a really, really nicely annotated thing, you would put all those references in about every author. I know it could be tedious, but again, you don't need to read this stuff. That's the joy of it. You don't need to read it. For the people that do, are the geeks that want the little minutia and do that, it's there for them to do. And they don't have to buy that text. They can buy just a plain text. We'll get to that in a minute. So yeah, and in this one, it also has, so that's why, to me, this is a hybrid. I would call this a hybrid notes / annotated, because he's got other appendices in here called You and the Atom Bomb. Let's see what else. Because these aren't really so much annotations, but it goes along with it. These be appendices. And then there's his essays, Politics in the English Language, I think, or no, it doesn't seem to be the whole thing. I think it's talking about his language, but it talks about other things, or maybe it is. Maybe it very well is. George Orwell. See a letter. They've got some letters in here. The quotation of the whole letter. See, that's fabulous. You see, that's where, like in an annotation, where let's talk about Virginia Woolf. They refer to um, Charles Dickens, and they got little quotes from her diaries or letters, and if she references it. But if she wrote a whole essay on Dickens, or a review, or something like that, or critical material, pop that in the appendix, and yes, it makes the book really big, and sometimes it can make it unwielding and overblown. Yes, I do. But again, that will be a consideration for the person who's annotating and put it together. But again, here the bad thing is it's at the back, and that's what I dislike. So I think this is a halfway in between. I love this kind of stuff. I've been rambling so long here now, but I do love this stuff. And the introductions, as I say, should be at the back. Appendices are fine. I really like them. And I'm even happy to pick up a text that doesn't have any of this material in, because sometimes that is the cheapest way, and that's a lot of times e-copies are for older books. But I'm really curious of what other people think. Do you like notes, and to what extent? Do you like more detailed notes like this? Because, for instance, I saw DJ Taylor talking about the annotations, and he was talking about I think he was talking about The Clergyman's Daughter. But anyway, he was talking about one of his books where he has characters in there that are based on real characters in, I think it's South Bend or South End, where his family was from. And these are specific characters that they're based on, but he's changed their names. And so that's kind of interesting to have the references to who these people were. And whether he's mocking them or praising them or whatever, that's fabulous information for me. But do you care about that? And the thing is, if you don't care about that, then you can still read this and just ignore all that. But some people can't, because I reread again for the umpteenth time Gargantua Pantagruel by Rabelais, and it was translated and with notes by M.A. Screech. It's fabulous. It's got everything in there. It's got descriptions in the notes, and these are footnotes. So I was reveling in this. Of every sort of alternate printing, the differences, stuff that was taken out. And also too, like you'll have square brackets for this long passage was taken out of the later edition or added in the later edition, and so it's all that, and then description at the beginning, because there's all the references where all the Renaissance references, all the religious references. I love that, but somebody else that I know read that, they thought it was overwhelming because they felt the need to read it all, and they felt it was overwhelming. And that's where sometimes, if it's on your first read of something, it can be overwhelming, and I understand that. Do you feel that way on the first reading, or do you like that? I like it. I don't know if I'd feel it overwhelming on the first read, but as I say, I wouldn't want to read the critical material. The factual material and the extra stuff, I'm fine with reading on the first go. But by somebody telling me this is what this means, the text means this, that, I have a bit of a problem with. So we've got the annotations, the introductions. I think I've covered it all here now. Finally, a lot longer than I expected, but yeah, what do you think of endnotes, footnotes, or no notes? Annotation, no annotation. Introductions or no introduction? What kind of introduction, if it's a yes? What is acceptable to you? Or do you prefer the introductions in the front or well, I mean the critical material in the front, or everything in the back. Even a biographical information, everything in the back. See, to me, I'm happy with all that material in the back, but I want the end notes in the book. So it's like, they always put the introduction, or most of the time, at the front. So I'm just to be contrary, I suppose. I want everything the opposite way that they normally do it. Why not? Goes with my persona, I suppose. But anyway, I'd love to hear what you think. And if anybody else wants to make a response video, I do. I just hope. I have no intention of making this a controversial subject or contention, because I know I have preferences, but I wouldn't rail against, in seriousness, rail against one or the other. It's just an inconvenience, and that is not. But it would be great if somebody else did a video of their preferences for this, how, and if they like one thing, how do they like that? And also in the notes, please do write essays in the notes. For something like this, it's great to see what people or it prompts you to think. And all these things that have been happening, that's led up to this. It's like there was the book tag, the perfect book tag, that's made me think about this. How do you read, or not how do you read, what was those things about reading, why we read, and stuff like that. And I think there was one, how we read. All these things that sort of made me lead up to this, as a separation from those, but also contingent and connected to those. So anyway, I am rambling now at 27 minutes. I will see you later, BookTube.